There are two key elements of Ambassador Edward S. Walker's career that I greatly admire: his deep understanding of the Middle East and his championing of public diplomacy. In his 35 years with the diplomatic service, Ambassador Walker had significant experience in a number of critical countries in the region, many to which the Smith School sends students each year. He was in Syria early in his career and served as the ambassador to the United Arab Emirates, Egypt, and Israel. Smith has a partnership with the American University of Sharjah in the UAE that allows students to spend a semester there. We have also sent nearly 600 MBAs and undergraduates to the UAE over the last 5 years on faculty-led, short-term study abroad programs. Smith is also engaged in a variety of ways with partners institutions in Israel. Latterly in his career, Ambassador Walker served as an Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs in the Clinton and George W. Bush administrations. Following his retirement from the Foreign Service, he was named President and CEO of the Middle East Institute and was credited with changing the organization's academic image and making it a vital contributor to current affairs. In a 2005 convocation address, Walker remarked that time and necessity will change the face of the Middle East, and the United States must be sensitive to issues of Arab pride, nationalism, and culture. The events across the region over the past few years would certainly bear this reflection out, and we look forward to hearing more from the Ambassador on these topics this afternoon. As a former public diplomacy practitioner, the second element of the Ambassador's career that I greatly admire is his support and advocacy for public diplomacy. I spent almost 8 years with the British Council, one of the UK's institutions responsible for public diplomacy, in roles that often required me to make the case for its value to government and to other stakeholders. The Ambassador has testified numerous times in front of Congress and signed his name to petitions and reports, efforts which have all championed investment in this people-to-people kind of diplomacy, two-way communication and engagement between the US and the rest of the world, not only as a means to further foreign policy objectives, but to build sustainable business relationships. It is in this spirit that I invite our next speaker to the stage about issues related to emerging markets in the Middle East. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor of Government at Hamilton College, Ambassador Edward Walker.
I urge you to pay attention to particularly what Lubna was saying about how you deal with people in the region, because it's not self-evident. I had a Secretary of Treasury when I was the ambassador in the UAE fly into the UAE. He came in unannounced. I knew about it, but I was there to meet him. And he said, I want to see Sheikh Zayed, who was the president of the UAE at the time. So let's go there. And I said, but Mr. Secretary, he doesn't know you're coming. I said, that's all right, he'll see me. So I get a hold of his primary staff guy that I know. I said, the Secretary of Treasury wants to talk to the president. And he's here, he just landed, and he has to leave in a half an hour. The secretary said, but he's asleep. I was a little naive at the time. It was my first ambassador, so I said, well, wake him up. And he said, are you kidding? I can't wake the president of the UAE up. He's a 76-year-old man. He needs to sleep. When he wakes up, the Secretary of the Treasury will be announced and he can go in. Well, typical of some of our American subtlety, the Secretary wasn't prepared to wait, so he got on the plane and left. We were able to sort it out later on, but what was missing was in the Secretary's briefing how to handle this society, how to handle this meeting, and so on. He should have been warned. He should have known. You don't do it that way. I've had numerous very important businessmen, CEOs of major corporations, come into my various embassies to meet with ministers, senior ministers in government in Egypt, so on. And they want to come in, sit down, do the job, do the business, sign the papers, and get out. And they give a half an hour for it. It doesn't work. The first half hour is just getting to know somebody. You can't do business unless you know who you're dealing with, at least not in the Middle East. And there's a lot of charm to that, because it's a more personal, intimate way of dealing with people. But it's based on a long-standing tradition, is if you don't trust somebody, you don't do business with them. And so it's developing that trust that's all important. That's a little bit off the subject that I was going to talk about, but when I was an ambassador in several Middle East countries, the job had any number of problems from time to time, but it also involved a number of givens that made the Middle East region much more predictable. Mubarak was predictable. Hafez al-Assad was generally predictable. Gaddafi was predictably unpredictable. But in each case, you had a very good idea of where these gentlemen were coming from and where you could expect them to go in the future. They had a set of well-established tools that stabilized their countries and their regimes. And we didn't appreciate those tools particularly. We didn't really like the way they ran their countries, but it wasn't our business, it was theirs. And when you consider that Mubarak had a 40-year run without a lot of problems, he knew something about his country and how to deal with it. So they had these tools that ensured their survival. And among these tools were these four that I picked out. There's a lot more, of course. One is the figurative thumbscrew, and the belief that the authorities would use such devices without consequences. Number two, control of the rewards in their society. Rewards go only to those who bow and scrape before the authorities. Number three, the image of invincibility. Invincibility. The leader cannot be toppled, and so there's no point in even trying to do so. And finally, total control of the narrative. That meant media, internet, whatever. You've got to have control over the narrative. Well, the Arab Spring challenged that formula for these leaders. As a result, there have been profound changes in the Middle East, which are calling into question established traditions and leadership, but are also opening up opportunities for the people of the region, also for us. Now, let me give you a little background first, because you can't talk about the Middle East. There is no the Middle East. There is no the Arab world. The MENA region is an area of 22 independent countries with from 320 to 360 million Arabic speakers. It's a huge market. The World Bank notes that in 2012, these 22 countries had a combined GDP of $1.6 trillion and a per capita GNI of about $3,450 in current US dollars. Now, that's not distributed equally among the 22 countries, for obvious. According to the IMF, the world GDP growth in 2012 was projected to be at 5.3%, and in 2013 at 3.6%. Most of that growth is taking place in the oil-producing countries, and particularly in Libya at this point. Even so, even with this growth, the oil-producing countries are taking steps to diversify their economies. And one key indication of this effort, as reported by the Science Matrix, is that the number of Middle Eastern scientific publications listed in the Web of Science database has grown nearly 4 times faster than the world average. This is a region on the move. In comparison with the BRIC countries, MENA is larger than Brazil or Russia in terms of population and GDP. And MENA residents have higher average disposable income than China or India. It's a significant market, but there are challenges. First of all, you have to be aware of the generalizations about the Middle East. Differences between countries and the subregions are profound. What applies for North Africa will not apply in Syria or Iraq, and hardly ever in the Gulf. Differences between countries and even within countries apply to their history. Egypt's been around for more than 5,000 years, but most MENA countries are relative newcomers to the world stage. Borders. Most borders today are resulted from the breakup of the Ottoman Empire after the First World War. Modernization. Modernization in the region has lagged behind the West. In Abu Dhabi, for example, the first high school was not established until 1958. That's when I graduated from high school. Tell you something about my age. Religion. There are as many flavors of Islam, going from the pacifism of Sufism to the extremism of Al-Qaeda and the fundamentalism of the Salafis and the Wahhabis. One size does not fit all. Colloquial language. I have Arab friends in Egypt who can't talk to a neighbor who is from the Bedouin tribes and understand them. I had one occasion in the Gulf where I was speaking Arabic. I went in to talk to the president of the country. He had to get his son in to translate my Arabic into his Arabic because the dialect is so different. Culture. In Saudi Arabia, for example, you can move from sophisticated modernists in a place like Jeddah to tribal structures in the center of the country and in the east to the desert Bedouin in the south. Resources. Enormous differences in the availability of critical resources such as oil and water. That's just to mention a few of the disparities that exist in this region. And yet, we talk about the Middle East. It doesn't make sense. Too many politicians and even some noted academics try to make it into one size fits all, or at best they distinguish between oil exporters and oil importers. Now, major changes are taking place in each of the Middle East countries, and the reality is that because of the internet, we know more about them, and they are more transparent than they have ever been. They know more about us as well. Our knowledge is often imperfect, but it's improving. For example, the accuracy of metrics in these countries has improved markedly over the past 10 years under the pressure from the IMF, the World Bank, and aid donors. But more knowledge does not necessarily mean more perception. This was particularly relevant to the situation in the Middle East prior to the Arab Spring. Over the 5 years prior to the spring, Egypt had been enjoying an average of 6% growth and Tunisia 4.8% growth. That's not bad. That's pretty good. And yet you had revolutions in both countries, despite the fact that everything was going fairly well. These figures don't tend to indicate to anybody looking at the situation of a potential revolution. I was in Egypt a week before the damn thing broke out, and I never had the slightest hint, and I've been studying the area for a long time and living in it. I was talking to the ministers and to some academics in Egypt. They didn't have any slightest idea either. So, it's sometimes it catches you. It catches you. This was a rebellion that was driven not by poverty or the broad majority of workers and farmers. It was fueled by the perception of the haves against the have-nots and the privileged against the non-entitled. It was compounded by a sense of entitlement on the part of traditional leaders and their perceived arrogance in relation to the population at large. The sense of injustice was profound, and it was fueled by expanded access to and knowledge of what was going on in the rest of the world. Both the Tunisian and Egyptian revolutions were ultimately triggered by abuse of power and the visibility of that abuse. In Tunisia, on Friday, December 17th, a fruit seller in a remote town, not this year, Mohammed Bouazizi, was stopped by a policewoman, Fedya Hamdi, for selling without a license. She and a colleague wanted to steal his fruit. He protested at the police chief and she was furious. So she sought him out, took his load of apples, hit him with her baton and slapped his face. Terrible insult in his culture and society. He set himself on fire as a gesture of protest and subsequently died. His family arranged a local protest and captured it on their cell phones. It went viral, and a mass protest took place, leading quickly to President Ben Ali's flight to Saudi Arabia. In Egypt, the history of the protest went all the way back to 2008, several years before the Tahrir Revolution. A strike was called against the state textile company, and a Facebook page was set up called the April 6th Youth Movement to build support. The strike didn't amount to anything, actually, but bloggers used Facebook, Twitter, Flickr, and YouTube to drum up support and organize the strike. They used tactics imported from Serbia that have been used to help bring down the regime of Slobodan Milosevic, and then were used in the Ukraine and Georgia. The strike was the event that brought together the young organizers of the subsequent revolution. The immediate stimulus for the subsequent January 25th resolution was Khalid Said, a young educated blogger. He took cell phone pictures of two policemen who arrested a drug dealer and then sold the drugs they had confiscated for personal profit. The police came after him, pulled him out of an internet cafe and beat him to death. Someone took pictures of his mutilated body and posted them on a website named We Are All Khalid Said. Called for a protest at Tahrir Square on January 25th. It went viral. Thousands of views were recorded. Tens of thousands of people showed up for that protest on the 25th. They were met by government goons, allegedly called out by Mubarak's son Gamal. And the rest, of course, is history. Gamal and his brother and father are now in prison, still waiting for justice. If you want to have an aha moment, it is to see Mubarak, for me to see Mubarak, who the last time I saw him in person was in his palace, in his golden chairs, in front of his large painting of the rape of the Safavid women, and why he had that I have no idea. And then to see him in this little cage in his prison uniform, that had an impact on me. Can you imagine what that did to the people of Egypt and how they were suddenly liberated by that kind of thing? So Mubarak's humiliation was unthinkable in a year or two before Tunisia. And in fact, several factors have changed our work across the region that are changing all of the equations and how one has to look at the region. One is the significant growth in the proportion of young people entering the workforce over the past 5 years, the so-called youth bulge. This has been due to substantially improved health services with a parallel decline in infant mortality, as well as a tendency to delay first pregnancies, in part because of the difficulty for young people in finding jobs, and in part because women are better educated today. They understand what spacing means for their own health. The result is a rapid increase of youth in the region, putting pressure on governments for education and jobs, and rising frustration with governments that cannot provide them. Second factor is the persistent unemployment of the 15 to 25-year-olds in virtually every Arab country in the MENA area. The region needs to create 100 million jobs in the next 10 years. That's just keeping up with population growth. Youth in the MENA region are having to go through a wrenching cultural change in most countries, from a system where the government provided guaranteed jobs to a system which is increasingly dependent on the private sector. At the same time, most education systems have not adjusted to this transfer from the public to the private sector, so that young people are not competitive in the new setting. What this means is that the unemployment rate for young males has now reached 26% and 40% among young females. More to the point, since Tahrir, youth unemployment has tended to increase among those with a higher level of education, exceeding 15% for those with college degrees in Egypt, Jordan, and Tunisia. At the same time that unemployment has been increasing, the private sector has been pulling back, driven by the uncertainty that followed by Mubarak's ouster and the reign of the Muslim Brotherhood. Overall, according to World Bank figures, MENA has a higher unemployment rate among youth, which is 26%, than Sub-Saharan Africa, which is 18%, Latin America, 17%, and all of Asia, 11%. While many young men rely on their families to tide them over, the reality is that the lack of a job puts their lives on hold. In a Gallup survey, young people felt that decent jobs were required before they could get married, start a family, and be considered an adult. I've seen this stress over and over among young men and women in the region and in the families of some of my friends. Marriage and family is put off because there is no home for a young man to take his bride to. The fact is that the culture and religion both put pressure on young people to get married and have children, and they can't. At least they think they can. This job deficit and attendant frustration among the young is a major problem and has been a continuing factor in the youth rebellion and will continue to be so. So when you add the progress that the region has had in the area of education, where more and more young people are getting educated to a higher and higher level, including women, and then you don't give them a job. You can't provide a job. The frustration factor is going through the roof. The percentage of young people going to college has been increasing over the past decade, is now as high as 30 to 40% in some countries. Given the rise in youth population, this represents a substantial increase in graduates with expectations of good jobs that cannot be met. Expectations are dashed. Egypt produced 343.5 thousand university graduates in 2011. But polls of university graduates suggested that 50% of them do not feel that they have been prepared for a workforce that can evolve from the state sector to the private sector. As a result, the majority of youth want jobs in government. Asked in a national survey about their sector of preference, 72% noted that working for the government is better than working for the private sector. Job security is most prized, and public sector job carries with it respect. By contrast, young people refer to disrespectful treatment by employers in the private sector, invoking images of slavery as if they had bought you. Private sector, which we had expected at my embassy in the mid-90s to be the hope of the future, cannot fill the gap. Instead, is even under a cloud today of corruption from the Mubarak era. So over 300,000 young men and women go to college, to open the door to good jobs and a family, and then find themselves blocked. Imagine going through college, and your only job, if you're lucky, is that you get to be somebody serving up the hamburgers at McDonald's. It's not just frustration at the local conditions that's causing this problem, but also the ability through the internet to see that other societies and young people in other countries are faring a lot better than you are. So whose fault is that? Well, it's certainly not your fault. Not even your educational system, it's your leadership. They're at fault. And on this, another factor affecting stability across the region is that with a new generation coming of age, we're seeing growing use of the internet and social media to communicate across borders and cultures. There's a double-digit growth in internet use, which is rapidly escalating. In the region as a whole, there is over 100% penetration of mobile phones. 100%. And in some areas, it's up to 200% because every young person obviously has to have 2 different mobile phones, one for each system. It's not as if they're not available to find out what's going on with their colleagues in other countries. With the increase of internet and mobile phone use, the cost of communicating between and within countries has declined to the point that young men and women can communicate with each other across towns and across borders. It used to cost a lot of money to call another country. It doesn't anymore. It doesn't. And that makes a huge difference. The people are in communication with each other, and governments, despite their efforts, have been unable to keep up with this or control it. It has opened up the internet generation not only to models for organizing their own societies, as the individuals exchange their experiences, but also the models in other countries. Egyptian demonstrators cited such examples as Serbia and the color revolutions as places where they had learned tactics for non-violent demonstrations. And if you want to get an idea of just how prevalent this problem or this opportunity is, in 2010 there was a 78% annual growth rate in Facebook use in the Arab world. And of these, the youth between 15 and 29 made up 75% of the Facebook users. Now, of course, Facebook is not all political. There are a lot of different reasons for using Facebook. But some of it is political. And some of it is exposure to what other young people are doing and how their society is presiding over their education in their countries. According to Facebook and Google, the MENA region has the highest growth rate in the world in use of social media products. The internet is liberating, particularly for young women. For probably or possibly obvious reasons, the highest usage of the internet by women in the world is in Saudi Arabia. I'll leave to you to figure out why. As we've seen since January, young people are not just using these tools for social purposes. Some of them are using them to organize politically. Thus, the changes in demographics, education, technology, and global access have put tremendous strains on traditions and caused a growing gap between the attitudes of the generations. The older generation, which is still in most positions of leadership and power, does not share the same values or information base as their children. If the character of the population has changed markedly, then so has the nature of the issues that galvanize the youth. Throughout the 1990s and well into the beginning of the 21st century, the key issues that drove unrest were pay and prices. Those are still factors. Cost of living, for example, particularly for basics that affect everybody, like food prices, have gone up, while incomes have not. But the economic issues are no longer at the forefront. In the Arab Spring, 2 issues were predominantly cited by protesters: corruption and abuse of power. In a World Bank study in 2008, MENA fared better than East Asia, Latin America, South Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa on the issue of corruption. Only the OECD and Eastern Europe did better. But that's not the perception that young people have in the Middle East. They see their condition as being worse than virtually everywhere else. The sense of corruption is fueled by the corresponding perception also found in Gallup polling that good jobs go to young people with well-positioned parents rather than based on performance or talent. You have to have pull or wasta. It's a short step from there to the belief that the system and the leadership are corrupt and must be changed. Young people formed the core of the Chapter protests, but by all accounts, the social issues they considered to be the most important were not democracy or human rights. In polls, they have stressed in the following order of importance: poverty reduction, 92%, not for them, but for their society as a whole. altruistic looking outward. Rising prices, 90%. Fighting corruption and entitlement, 88%. And reforming the educational system, 86%. If you took the same kind of poll in this country, you'd come up with a totally different set of priorities. But in their societies and in their cultures, these are the things that count. Only 63% said it was important for people to have a larger role in government. In Egypt, 2/3 of the population are under 30, and the young make up 90% of the nation's unemployed. Official rate's 9.4%, but the real number is quite different. Just to stand still, Egypt will have to create up to 10 million jobs over the next decade. But jobs are in short supply, and the immediate prospect is not very encouraging. The uncertainty that accompanied the protests brought new job-creating foreign direct investment down to a trickle. One Egyptian official told me that it was down to 0 now. Tourism, a major employer and critical for the future of the region, is on life support. Since most of the regimes in the Middle East are paternalistic, with the underlying message that the state will provide, expectations by the young of their leaders are vastly inflated. Polls show that the sizable number of young people in the region aspire to government positions. The problem is the government cannot solve their problems or provide them jobs. And meanwhile, the trappings of wealth continue to be flaunted by the privileged and wealthy in gated communities, fancy cars, and the images are magnified through the exchange of information and the internet. These pressures have grown with the taste of success among demonstrators as dictators have toppled. What was always thought to be impossible and unthinkable has now become possible and thinkable. Populist pressure is likely to continue to be exerted and to even increase on the issues of governance, fairness, and representation, as well as the issue of Israel, the West, and the adherence to Islam. There are 83 million Egyptians today. By 2025, projections by the Population Reference Bureau puts the number at 103 million. 20 million more mouths to feed. 20 million more children to educate. 20 more million in need of health care. And the difficulties in Egypt pale by comparison to the problems that the Syrians face at this point in their history. For many years, our Syria policy was a function of our Soviet policy. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, Syria became an afterthought to our Russian policy. But then the Arab Spring rose up to challenge the Assad regime. As in Egypt, social media played its part. But it was quickly eclipsed by regime-orchestrated violence. Whereas in Egypt, the military sought the support of the people, in Syria, the regime saw the people as the enemy. And this was due to the fact that the stakes were different. Something we seldom think about. Bashar al-Assad, after a moment to catch his breath, reverted to the policies of his father to regain control. Brutal repression was driven by the certain knowledge on the part of Assad and his fellow Alawites that their future in the confrontation meant certain torture and death for Assad and his family and displacement of the Alawite elites by the Sunnis with a long score to settle. When you're facing that kind of potential result, you fight. Your back is to the wall. And that is exactly what the Syrian leadership feels. It's a fight to the finish. No quarters given and no quarters expected. Thus far, Assad and brutality appear to be winning this round, at least for now. Dictators in the region and elsewhere have learned that the same tools used by the protesters can also be turned around and used against them and play on the popular fear of instability. But their supremacy has been shaken, including the supremacy of the Assad family. We substitute our own history and culture for that of the country we're dealing with, and then wonder why they don't behave the way we expect them to. We tend to forget the costs and benefits that authoritarian leaders have to consider if they're to stay in power. And we seem to have little appreciation for the internal dynamics that drive other countries. What is the basis for the dispute resolution in much of the world? We all come out, and many of us come out of a Western European background, some maybe British background, and so forth. We have the prevailing policy or philosophy, the good old boy British concept of the Marquis of Queensberry. But that's not what the rest of the world works on. I would even Warren venture to say that the Britons don't work that way either, but that's all right. It's now more an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And the biblical injunction is far more deeply ingrained than the British colonial concepts of fair play. The only rule that counts in a place like Damascus is who wins. It's not how you play the game. And until we realize that, until we start taking that into account, we aren't going to make the right policy decisions. The cost for the loser is not to lick their wounds and come back to fight another day. The cost is death, torture, the murder of loved ones, subjugation of an entire family, tribe, or sect. These are big stakes. So when we try to champion concepts like the rule of law or human rights, people aren't likely to be listening. The reason our democracy works is that losers in our system are not put on the rack or hung from the lampposts. They are not dragged out of a culvert and beaten to death, or pulled from a hidey hole and hung before the world's press. So the message for dictators is not one of reform and accommodation, but of retrenchment. Today, their tools are getting rusty. They still can resort to the thumbscrew, as Assad has done in Syria, but the people are no longer cowed. Where we and the international community can have an impact is on disabusing the belief that there will be no consequences to these people. The dictators can still control what rewards in their societies, but we can make those rewards more costly through judicious and targeted use of sanctions. And every dictator who falls works to fracture the image of invincibility that has sustained so many. Finally, total control of the narrative is no longer possible, even in highly repressive societies. We have to be realistic about how much impact we can have. Back in the 90s, we still had an economic assistance package in Egypt, for example, that gave us access to the ministries and ministers. That no longer exists except in the military. Back in the 90s, the United States was still respected as a model. Today, association with the U.S. can be a net negative. Back in the 90s, we had allies in the region who supported us and valued our advice. But we're no longer in the 90s. Thank you.
We'll take one question. We're out of time, so let's go with the one question.
One question.
Thank you, Mr. Walker. That is very interesting. I guess as someone who studies social media, one of the questions that has always bothered me is to what extent is social media truly implicated in all of these revolutions we see? Because, not that argued in his article that the American Civil Rights Movement, which of course predated the internet and social media, had a way of organizing and a structural presence, which is no different from what we see happening with social media. So my question to you is, would we have seen this had we not had the internet and Facebook and Twitter?
Yes, you would have seen it.
Oh.
And the reason is that all social media is a tool. It is accentuating, maybe magnifying, But you go back to the Revolutionary War. We had the effect of social media as people were galvanized and brought together to fight. Social media is a more efficient way of doing it. And you can probably build a larger group of supporters through social media. But it doesn't change the basic premise that you have to have a cause. And that has to appeal to people. And that was one of the problems with the Egyptian Tahrir Revolution. They had a cause. That was to get rid of Mubarak. And what after that? They didn't have a follow-up. They hadn't really thought through. What happens? My God, what happens if we win? They didn't even anticipate that they could win. And so they were not prepared for the results. And they lost the dynamic movement to the army first, then to the Muslim Brotherhood, and then back to the army. And so we really don't have profound change, but we do have profound change in the sense that people's eyes are awakened. People know now they can do something they never thought they could do before. So I would suggest that in the future, what we're going to see is a lot more instability in dictatorships, and that we will see a profound change in the way the world appreciates it. Thank you.
Any other questions? Yes, there's one back here.
Thank you, Ambassador. I really appreciate your talks and the context for doing business in, because I think these issues are very critical. It occurs to me that maybe the U.S., if not the Washington Consensus, does have something from our own history to contribute in this particular context. And I think of the revolution of rising expectations that we went through ourselves here in the United States with the inequality and the discrimination and the exclusion of so many people from our economy that led to the same kinds of upheavals, and also led to some creative and collaborative efforts still ongoing to be able to address some of those issues of lack of jobs, lack of opportunities, lack of educational preparation for the workforce. So I just wanted to mention that and ask if there are some nascent educational business development forces that are bubbling up from below rather than top down, and if there's a role for us to play in being helpful in this regard in the current day.
That is one of the more exciting things that's going on in the region and in the world. My wife is an associate or is a partner in a group that tries to educate or train young, aspiring entrepreneurs. Obviously you have to have a certain way of approaching life to be a good entrepreneur, but also there are things you have to learn in order to do it, in order to make it the transition, and also grow your company and so on. Well, that's what she's doing. She's working with Egyptians and Saudis and so on, and Americans, of course. That's going on, and that's bottom up. It's very exciting. If you really want to have a good time, go to one of these meetings, and particularly at my age, and see these young people with their energy and spirit and commitment and belief that they will prevail. That's very encouraging. And I think, the future's looking good. Usually when I give a talk, everybody's depressed. Try to change it.
Thank you for the speech. My name is Lisa Yasakin. I was wondering, based on what you said, how can we take that module of the younger generation being charged and being young entrepreneurs to places like Africa, for example? Other nations.
Yeah, well, that's the thing that excites me about what my wife is doing, what actually she's not doing, but all the people that she's engaged with, is that it is universal. It is in multiple continents. There is a group in Africa doing startup nation, building startups in Africa, building startups in Latin America, young people with ideas. Now, look, let's be realistic. Most of the ideas aren't going to make billion-dollar companies. Most of them are just like basically apps for the iPhone. But there's still a lot of money to be made with apps, and it is an education into how to engage in the business world and how to use your skills and the skills of others around you to make something that's saleable, that actually is marketable. So I find it really a lot of fun, very encouraging to see the imagination. Some of the apps are unbelievable, but some of them are not particularly, some of them are X-rated too. But it is the imagination and the spirit that I find so captivating in this, and that's international. I think we went to Brazil. We sat startup weekend in Brazil. We're going to another foreign country, Syracuse, New York, and it's an interest that is burgeoning just in the last 5 years. So it's no longer just a function of California. Now it's across the United States. My wife went down to Mississippi and did a startup area down there. We're going to Toronto to do it. It's unstoppable, and we're all going to profit from it. Because to the extent that you can start to make a real inroad into giving people a sense that they can do something individually, they can have an impact, and that they can make money. That's ultimately good. I'll try it. So next time you hear of a startup weekend somewhere, go to it, enjoy it, see what it does. Listen, thank you all very much.
A token of appreciation for Ambassador Walker. Let's have another round of applause.